I'm Rob Vestrom, and my co-author is Greg Cameron, and we're with Thrust Belt Imaging, and our talk is on the challenges we face in seismic imaging in fold and thrust belts, like the foothills of the Canadian Rockies. Seismic imaging in the foothills is not for the timid geoscientist. The seismic data in these complex structure areas in the foothills is characterized by low data density, high noise content, and high geologic complexity. Rough topography and near-surface weathering obscure the subsurface. These are really difficult problems to overcome. If we can overcome these problems, then we can create an interpretable seismic image, and we do that with migration. Seismic migration creates the final image for interpretation. Pre-stack time migration, or PSTM, is robust, but positioning is approximate and the data are in time. And of course, we want to drill in depth. Pre-stack depth migration, or PSDM, is more accurate, but it requires a more accurate velocity model. Now, these are the two simple categories, and there are a whole wide range of flavors that fall within the time and depth imaging suite of tools. Collaboration with the structural geologist and understanding the regional geologic setting are essential to imaging success. That's the theme that I want to get across in the next 20 minutes. First, let's have a quick look at the seismic experiment. We've got our source location in the near surface. We send energy down into the subsurface, and we see our downgoing wave is propagated quite a distance in the subsurface. From this downgoing wave, we've got some reflections. Off the red reflector, for the red unit, we've got this reflection energy that's coming upwards, indicated by these little gray arrows. At some earlier time, we had a reflection from that red unit, from the yellow unit here, and that's come up quite a ways toward the surface. Now, the snapshot of a wavefront is not that exciting, but I thought I'd show you this, and then we can watch the wave actually propagate. So as the wave propagates, we can see it bounce off that fault plane, boom, nice big reflector, and now it's going to reflect off of this yellow unit, and it does. And now it's going to reflect off the red unit. And there is our reflection energy as it propagates up back towards the near surface. And you can see it's going to arrive at a very different time. Here it's already arriving, and it's going to come in sometime later over on the foreland side of this fault. So there's lots of stuff going on here with these waves, lots of noise, surface conditions, and a lot of problems and that we want to resolve. And we don't really want the wave field. What we want is a picture of the seismic reflectors that make that wave field. Okay, so let's look at a shot record that we've recorded from the field. It just has so much noise, and so we've got these surface waves in here, as labeled in here. We've got these noise bursts, these high frequency noise bursts running down and through here. And if we can, the nice thing about surface waves is they're reasonably predictable in their behavior, and if they're predictable, we can remove them. So most of these surface waves are removed, and from behind the surface waves, we can start to see some of this reflection energy in these various areas. That's going to stack up and create our seismic image in the end, behind all that noise. Now, here is a stacked image. This is an unmigrated section. We've got the subthrust target over here, and we haven't corrected for weathering effects yet. And we've got this mountainous areas, obviously lots going on here, and out into the foreland side. And we've got this deep foreland reflector over here on the right. And out in the foreland, we've got these low velocities, so there's going to be a time delay associated with that. And this data is displayed in time, so if we remove the time delay, then that reflector is going to move upwards. So it's shifted after we remove the weathering time delay. It's also a little more coherent. You can see we maybe have some weathering pockets that's resulted in these static problems, and we've got a much improved reflector coherency out in here. And going back to the target, we can see we've got a much better perspective on the subthrust target before the weathering and then after the weathering. Okay, so let's talk about migration. So this is so similar, a stack section looking thing. We've got uncollapsed diffraction energy. Things are crossing each other. The whole thing doesn't look very geological. But like I said earlier, we don't want the wave field that we record in the field. What we want is a picture of the reflectors that created this wave field. So what we do is the process called migration, and you can see why, because we move the seismic reflection energy into the position of their reflector. And you can see we've over-migrated, now we've under-migrated, back to over-migrated again, and back and forth. And this is the thing of stuff of nightmares, because you can see the structure gets bigger and smaller, and it's the source of geophysics jokes where people would say, well, how big a structure do you want to see? Do you want to see a fold or do you want to see a fault? This type of thing, because there's some latitude to work with as we over-migrate and under-migrate the data. Now, I stopped this movie here at a place where we've got a reasonably good-looking geologic-looking features. You've got this anticline and the syncline over here on the right, and you can see there's some ambiguity involved. Now, thank goodness, when we actually go to pick pre-stack time migration velocities, where we average through the near-surface effects, the seismic data isn't very coherent at the wrong velocity. So here's a low velocity panel. We've got pretty good reflector coherency in the shallow section. We're going to do is movie through here and see how the image changes as we go to higher and higher velocities and then back. Over on the right image is the composite image of the velocity picks. So it's just basically the shallow velocities, and we just don't have much on the image. Now as we watch the movie go, we go to the velocities are too high, velocities are too low, somewhere in the middle we can see things come into focus. Now I'll start making some velocity picks here, and then if you look over here on the image on the right, the composite image gets updated real time as we make these picks. You can see over here we're coming down into the syncline now, having a few troubles because synclines are tricky to image, and it's especially tricky to image below synclines. I'll show you an example of that in a bit. And then now we've got basically 30 seconds here. I've shown several hours worth of work and trying to come up with pre-stack time migration velocities that optimize the final pre-stack time migrated image. Now the advantage of pre-stack time migration is that it has this robust method. We can do these movies, we can search the velocity space for for the reflectivity that we want to see, for the coherency we hope to achieve, and then we can the process that QCs itself, because we can see if we've got strong stack power or not. Now the downside of that is we're definitely averaging through a lot of the near surface effects, so the RMS velocities aren't necessarily going to make geologic sense. So here's the RMS velocity picked on this anticline-syncline pair. And notice that even though this is like basically the same rock layer running across here, the RMS average velocity, pre-stack time migration velocity, is not consistent over top. And well, one might say, oh look, this fracturing over top, maybe it's got lower velocities. But I say what's happening here is not the case. What's happening over this anticline-syncline pair is that we're averaging through the near surface effects. And actually the big effect that we're averaging through here is seismic anisotropy. So over the anticline we've got this low velocity, and under the syncline we've got the higher velocity than the velocities around it. And the anisotropy effect means that we've got higher velocity in the direction parallel to bedding and a lower velocity in the direction perpendicular to bedding, and that bedding orientation changes as we go from anticline to syncline. So then when we try to image below the anticline, the rays that image that point of the subsurface, the energy is going to travel along the direction normal to bedding for the most part, or the lowest velocity direction. So on average it's going to be a lower velocity than the rocks, than the average velocity through the rocks nearby. Underneath the syncline, now we're averaging through these directions that are at angles oblique to bedding, and the velocity is higher in the direction oblique to bedding. So then we end up with a higher average or RMS velocity below the syncline. So we can kind of come up with a reason for it, but averaging through these effects is not necessarily going to help us. Now I'm just going to step back for a second and talk about seismic anisotropy, and then I'll show you how we correct for it with depth imaging. Seismic anisotropy is an interesting phenomenon, and it comes from a few different sources. One of them is the preferential alignment of clay minerals on the microscopic scale. Your platelet-shaped grains of shale are aligning themselves up reasonably flat. And so then the material becomes more grain supported horizontally, less grain supported vertically. What I think is more intuitive, if we think of this effect of periodic thin layering, so we've got interbedded sands and shales or interbedded shales and carbonates, then the material is less compressible horizontally and more compressible vertically. Now I say compressibility, it makes me think of a kitchen sponge that I have that's got a very firm layer for when you do some solid scrubbing, and then it's got a really soft layer in yellow here. So let's say I just spill my coffee and I just need to clean it up. I don't need much action. And now those two layers are going to interact with each other, as you can see as I squeeze these two layers together. Well, this is not as exciting as if we had a whole sequence of them. Now when I go to compress this entire sequence of interbedded layers, then you can see the yellow layers are very compressible, so the material itself is quite compressible in the direction normal it's bedding. If I tried to squeeze it horizontally, then the stiff green layers are going to resist the compression. So then the material becomes much less compressible in the horizontal direction. So we'll end up with a high compressional velocity parallel to bedding and a low compressional velocity perpendicular to bedding. So seismic anisotropy and velocity heterogeneity must be corrected using depth imaging. Pre-stack depth migration requires this geologic model to accurately correct for these velocity effects. So when we've got these dipping layers, we've got a high velocity direction in the direction parallel to bedding, low velocity in the direction perpendicular to bedding, then the wavefront is going to be skewed to one side. And this is a simplified, very simplified view of the near surface. This is on the road to Banff from Calgary, and so we get this lateral shift that results from this wavefront propagation effect. But really, in reality, in a thrust belt environment, we have a significant varying dip in the near surface. So we need to make sure that we include that dip in the depth migration. So we basically need a good structural model and a really good cross section in order to get an accurate depth migration in a thrust belt environment. So the example I've got here is seismic imaging below a large syncline in the Canadian foothills. We've got these laterally varying dips that cause imaging and position issues on the reflectors below. Okay, it's a bit of a busy diagram, so let's take it one bit at a time. We've got a pretty good pre-stack time migrated section here. The yellow is the syncline in the hanging wall of the thrust, and below we've got these two structures. We've got the blue structure in blue, the anticlinal structure, and we've got a duplex system in green, which isn't imaged very well. And then in the old days before correcting for anisotropy in the depth migration, this is where depth migration was difficult. If we ignore the anisotropy, we can actually, in the subthrusts, because we're correcting only for the ray bending or refraction under the thrust, in the image on the right, the duplex system in the green, it images actually quite a bit better. Here's the time image, and here's the depth image. And we've got more detail in this duplex system in here after correcting for the ray bending, but ignoring the anisotropy. Now below the syncline is where synclines are tricky, as we saw with the pre-stack time migration. It's tricky to image underneath the syncline because we've got the velocities varying with direction. So when we do the anisotropic depth migration, we incorporate the dipping anisotropy into our velocity model, into our structural model for depth imaging. Then we can see we've resolved the anticlinal feature in the blue, and we've got a much cleaner look to the duplex system in the green. Now just flip back and forth here, and you can look at what's happening in the green structure. And also notice at the base of the syncline tightens up because of this velocity effect. It's like pulled apart. We ignore the anisotropy, the wave field is pulled apart, and it's not imaging very well. And if we correct for the anisotropy, it comes together, and we've got a nice tight image of a more geologic shape in the syncline. Now let's have a quick look at a structural geology update to a velocity model. This is on that Benjamin Creek data set that a lot of you may be familiar with. 2D line in the Canadian foothills. It doesn't have very long offsets. It's not very densely shot. So it's difficult to make improvements, and I'll show you in a minute as to how the progress or lack thereof we've made over the years. But I just want to point out that we need to do the seismically constrained velocity model building method, and we don't have enough seismic constraints to really build the velocity model. Look at all this detail we can put into our velocity model if we understand the structural interpretation. And I'll show you how the data responds. The seismic constraints are also helpful in this case. Now, in the near surface, we've got very low data density. And the near surface is the lens through which we've imaged the subsurface. So we really can't get the near surface structures from the seismic data. We need to get it from the geologic constraints, but then we can still use the seismic imaging as a constraint on the velocity model. So here's an example of that. We've got a structure at the Benjamin Creek 2D line. This fault is coming up to the surface here on the left. And this layer is quite thick in here, and the imaging has got some problems with the imaging below. Now, looking at the surface geology map, this rock unit doesn't come to surface here. So if we move the fault over to the left and the top of the horizon to the right and have it truncate against the fault, then we can update our velocity model this way, and it also improves the coherency of the seismic image. But let's have a look at the seismic image without the velocity model. So you can see we've got difficulties imaging in here. Some coherency is not consistent across here after the model update. So before, after, before, and after, you can see we've got a much better coherency thanks to the update near the surface. And that's the nice thing about depth imaging from an interpretation standpoint, is that we can test different model scenarios and see how the data responds to it, and to see, okay, this definitely confirms the hypothesis that we need a different structure near the surface. Also, we've got this nice fault plane reflector running in through here that we didn't have before, and now we're able to put that into our image. Now this is kind of funny, actually, this whole comparison. Here's time processing from 1997, published results, and then here is from 2022. And yeah, it's not a big leap forward, really, in imaging. And I think the big thing is we've got difficulty with limited data density and the limited offset range, so we don't have as much leverage to work with. We are getting more detail and these faults and all these fault systems in the deep section when we correct for the near surface effects. So we're getting more structural detail in the deep section with the depth migration from this year, as opposed to the time migration from decades ago and 25 years ago. And also notice that because we're in depth now, we've got this nice flat basement, and that's kind of a nice geologic constraint for our velocity model. Okay, one more data example. I just wanted to leave off on a data example. It's a lot more high density in the shooting of much longer offsets, much more sensitive to velocities. And here's the pre-stack depth migration model prior to a structural update. And you can see some of the horizons aren't quite matching with the imaging. There was a significant improvement in imaging through a few different efforts published by MacArthur et al. This year at the APG International Conference. And then as a result of the improved imaging, they made a new structural interpretation of the velocity model. It's a pretty subtle difference, but you can definitely see a difference in the below the syncline. And as I mentioned earlier, imaging below a syncline is a tricky business. So let's look at the imaging changes. Here's before and here's after the structural update. Below the syncline definitely looks much better. The footwall of the thrust is really where we see the big uplift. Significant improvement as we go before and after the structural update. And here's the pre-stack time migration for comparison. We've got a bit of a time pull-up underneath the fault, and definitely issues imaging at the base of the syncline. And here's the final depth migration. Just going back and forth to compare the footwall imaging, and the base of the syncline is significantly improved. Okay, just to conclude, structural complexity increases the difficulty in seismic imaging of subsurface reflectors. Pre-stack time migration, or PSTM, is a robust tool for areas where we have limited understanding of the subsurface structure. PSDM, or depth imaging, gives us a more accurate picture of the subsurface, but we need a geologically accurate model of the subsurface in order to achieve that image. It's a much more delicate process, right? So we definitely need the integration with structural geologists. And geologic understanding and collaboration are key levers to success in seismic imaging of foothills areas.